So, shall we get going? So the preamble here, who am I? So my name is Raphael van Lierop. I've been making games for about 14 years now, until a few years ago in the AAA game space. So I worked at Relic Ubisoft, and in 2012 I founded Hinterland. Some of the games that I've worked on in the past. So I've been at this for quite a while, and interestingly for me to kind of be working in the industry and experiencing this new transition. Unlike some games that have gone through Kickstarter or on early access, where the studios and the teams have grown up with that knowledge and that kind of development methodology, myself and the majority of my team are all from the sort of more traditional game space. So for us, there's been a lot of adaptation. A little bit about Hinterland. So founded in 2012, mostly industry veterans. We're a pretty small team, although we've been growing. At the beginning of the year, we were, or rather at the end of last year, we were about 8 people, and now we're up to 13. Mostly industry veterans, about 10 to 15 years experience. We're headquartered on Vancouver Island in Canada. I think we're probably the only developer that's far north, other than one other startup who we share an office with, who's in stealth mode, but hopefully you'll be hearing more about them soon. Mostly a Canadian team, mostly distributed. One of the benefits of being on beautiful Vancouver Island is that there's no game developers around to hire, so our team is generally distributed. The Long Dark is the first game that we've worked on together as a team, but collectively the team has shipped over 50 whatever games, 60 games. Shout out to my team who is hard at work on our next update while I stand here and bask in the glory of GDC. Long Dark is funded through Canada Media Fund, Kickstarter, and Early Access, and I'll share some numbers with you in terms of the sort of the proportion of the funding, just in case it's interesting to you. But we started as our prototype was funded by the Canadian government through a program called the Canada Media Fund, which is a recoupable loan, not a grant. We're actually in the process of paying it all back now, thanks to the success that we've had on early access. What is The Long Dark, just in case some of you don't know? It's a first-person, let's call it an art exploration survival game. It's immersive simulation, really. Post-disaster, there's a mystery in the world. There's no zombies. No hand-holding is part of our design philosophy, so the game is quite challenging. And partly, the design comes out of the years that we worked in AAA, where there's a lot of hand-holding of players and patting you on the back for doing really small, meaningless things. And I guess for us, the game is really partly a reaction to that, wanting to bring some of the challenge back in, wanting to treat our players like adults who can make decisions for themselves. We really try to reward player discovery in terms of learning how the mechanics of the game work. Our Sandbox mode, which is currently what is available on Steam Early Access, is a permadeath game. Story mode is really will be the launch of the game, which will be later this year. That's an episodic narrative-based experience. And that's The Long Dark. And that's a little bit of what it looks like. Oh, that's a little bit more about what it looks like. Okay, so some stats in case it's interesting to you. For our Sandbox mode, which is on early access, we sold over 300,000 units in the last 5 months on Steam. The breakdown is about 97% of our sales have been on Steam, 3% through Kickstarter, Humble, and some PayPal backing that we did once our Kickstarter campaign wrapped up. So as you can see, overwhelmingly, our community and our sales are coming from Steam. Top territories for us, by order of size: United States, Russia, Germany, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, France, Norway, Sweden, Japan. That actually hasn't changed much since we launched. There has been a little bit of movement in some of the, beyond the top 10 and the sort of the top 20. The game's been translated into 19 languages. We actually only did 4 of those. The rest were done by the community, which was pretty amazing for us to see. We released community translation tools, and within 48 hours of releasing those, we had 10 new languages translated. And now we're up to 19, and it's continuing to grow. So it's pretty exciting for us to see that level of engagement from our community. The game is being played in over 160 countries. And hopefully things will continue to go this way. Anecdotally, our wish lists on Steam are greater than our sales, so we think that the appetite for Sandbox is indicative of future success when we launch on story mode. So for us, it's definitely a development, a game that's continuously being developed. Sales are continuously coming in, but we think we're still within reach of another big push. So let's talk about what community-informed development is. First, we'll start by talking a little bit about what the old way of game dev that I and most of my team come from. So typically what you would do is you would work on something mostly in secret until it's finished, and then you would release it. Very little external noise. I put noise in quotes because certainly most of the feedback we get from the community is not noise, but within the traditional development model where you're working on a project in secret, you have very little outside input regarding what you're doing. So you also have very little validation. So in a lot of cases, any of us who've worked in the AAA space or bought a big game, an expensive game, have had that experience of the end result not meeting our expectations. And I think that's partly because we haven't, the process just didn't allow for a lot of validation kind of along the way. End results are often misaligned with the audience expectations, which is always a danger and a sort of a frightening thing for you if you're working on one of these big projects that you've put multiple years of your life into. Have it launch and then discover that your players maybe were looking for something different, or you delivered something that wasn't quite what you had promised or what they were expecting, and that obviously has an impact on sales and reviews and whatnot. And the focal point of the old way of development is really the launch. So everything is building up to that launch event. All the economics of the industry, the way sales work, the way development works, everything was built around that initial launch moment. Post-launch, in a lot of cases, was really an afterthought. Maybe over the last few years, we've started to focus a little more on DLC and whatnot. But generally speaking, you would launch your game. There's a little bit of customer service and whatnot afterwards, but pretty much after the first 6 or 8 weeks of that launch, players are onto something new, and you're working on your new game. The new way that we see, and largely this comes, there's a little bit of a question here that I won't get into during this talk, but I think it's an interesting one, which is, did community-informed game development emerge from the way the business has evolved and some of these new models like early access and Kickstarter and the crowdfunding movement, or is it the other way around? But anyways, the new way of game development is really about testing the waters at the concept phase. So really, really early in the process, already starting to solicit feedback from your community to try and understand what people like, what they're looking for. You're pulling your community in really early in the process. You're involving them in development in the form of taking their feedback. You're inviting them to participate in funding, whether it's through a crowdfunding campaign on Kickstarter or Indiegogo, or again in early access where you're taking people's money and you're involving them in the process of the game. The focal point is really that there isn't one, which is part of the kind of the risk and the challenge, I think, of this development model, is unlike the traditional way where everything is building up to a launch, and that was something that I think we quite well understood, and all our marketing and our PR apparatus in the industry was built around that focal point, that launch moment. With this new style of game development, this new methodology, we don't have that anymore. And I've witnessed myself many games that have been, for example, in early access on Steam, where I followed the game, and then it was like, on Friday, it was in early access, and on Monday, it was launched, and it didn't feel like anything really changed between those 2 dates. And I think that that's a really unfortunate thing for those projects, because that would have been a moment where traditionally they would have had a big push, and there would have been a lot of awareness around that. And largely it's because there is fundamentally almost no difference between the game as it existed on Friday and Monday when they flipped a switch. Post-launch, interestingly, in this kind of style of game development, everything is post-launch. So everything you're doing is kind of an ongoing dialogue with your community. You're constantly updating the game. So the whole experience of it is really kind of like a post-launch event. So the launch is sort of when you first announce your Kickstarter or when you first come to early access, and then everything from that moment on is sort of a post-launch. I kind of compare it a little bit, although I've never worked on an MMO. It seems like there's a lot of comparisons to be made between live development of an MMO game or any kind of an online game, and what we're doing with the game on early access, for example. Even though we're an offline game, it seems like we're putting out regular updates. We've got direct connection with our community. There's a lot of feedback coming both ways. So it feels very much like that style. Certainly you're not working in the dark for many months on end without sharing anything. You have to really be much more transparent. The old way of community relations, again, you'd work on a game. All the communication around that game would be mediated by the PR and the marketing departments to some degree. You as a developer might have no connection at all with your players, or if you did, it would be usually through journalists, and it would be very carefully mediated. Typically, 3 to 6 months from ship is where you would start to focus on building community and awareness for your game. If you're on if you're a PC game, historically, certainly until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, console games almost didn't even think about community until they were already launched. You ship the game, and then essentially you're following up after the fact with customer support queries more than anything else. So you're not, you might build a fan base due to the success of your game, but it's certainly not happening up front. The new way is that you have direct access to your community, which is, especially for developers like myself, really a refreshing kind of new reality for us to be able to talk directly to our customers, to our players, solicit their feedback, hear their stories about how much they're enjoying the game, sometimes about how much they're not enjoying the game. So it's pretty exciting to have that direct contact. Also, the community has direct access to you, which can also be great and sometimes not so much. But it's certainly something that you're kind of, it's a two-way discussion, and you're putting yourself out there and you're opening yourself up to having people contact you directly on your Twitter feed or sending you emails, or certainly we've seen how some of that can go awry in the industry. The community is involved with your game from the very beginning to the very end and beyond, so it's a long-term relationship than what we typically have dealt with. I don't even know what that was about. Community-informed development. A little blank, fill in your own point there. So let's talk about a little definition here. So I think community-informed development, when I speak of this, what I mean is it's a process by which you take feedback from your community and incorporate it into your decision-making. And it sounds like kind of a no-brainer, obvious definition, but I think it's worth calling out because I think this is different from making the game that the community wants. And the challenge is sometimes your community doesn't agree. So that's part of where the There Be Monsters comes from, is that it's a dialogue, there's a conversation, but ultimately, at least my point of view on community-informed development is that you're depending on your community to give you feedback, to give you data, but ultimately you're the ones that still have to make the decision, and you're not going to make the game for the community. You're making the game that you want to make with the community as a sounding board for ideas. And why is this difference important? Well, when you ask for feedback from people, you're involving those people with the process of development, the refinement that happens, the editorial process in the game, and it gives you an opportunity to test ideas theoretically with people. So you can put things in the game, you can put it out there to kind of see what people think, make a decision based on that as to whether you want to move forward in that direction, which is very different from the old way where you did everything kind of with blinders on and you just kind of hoped for the best, that it would turn out to be something that people enjoyed. I think when you have to go out and ask your community what to make, or when you open that door, it puts the community in the driver's seat, and the community doesn't belong in the driver's seat. The community is there as another tool, another data point, another voice for you to listen to, but they are not game developers. They are not people who've spent years and years of their life learning how to do this job. So I think that there's a danger there when you open it up too much and kind of let the community feel like they're running the show. I know it's maybe not as popular a way of approaching it or thinking of it, that lots of talks talk about how it's all open development, it's all about what the community wants. My opinion is that if you do that, then you're going to end up with, you're not going to have as strong an expression of your original creative vision as you would have if you hadn't done that. And I think certainly, we're getting a lot of benefit from the community. I'm not saying ignore the community. Obviously, we need to incorporate their ideas and their feedback, and that's a big part of what we're doing with the Sandbox and the Law and Dark. But we're making the game. It's our vision for the game. We're making the final decisions. And although we take all this feedback from the community, ultimately, we're the ones that are in charge. So it's a difference of guidance and direction, right? So guidance is someone gives you feedback on something so that you can make a good decision. Direction is someone tells you to do something. Sometimes the community thinks that they're giving you direction, which can be a challenge. Another thing to remember is we talk about community as though it's one thing, but it's not. It's an idea, but it's, in our case, many, many people that often have very different opinions about what the right answer is to a problem. So you have to keep in mind that there isn't, it's not like the dev team has one idea and the community has one idea, and it's kind of like, how do we make those two things fit? It's more like you have an idea, and then the community, which is thousands and thousands of people, have thousands and thousands of ideas, and how are you going to kind of incorporate those into what you're doing? So where does community-informed dev come from, this whole new kind of paradigm? I think a lot of it comes from, first of all, loss in faith of the AAA experience. So plunking down your $60 and expecting that you're going to get a great game. I think a lot of players, myself included, have kind of lost faith in that model. We've been sort of cheated or tricked too many times. So now we're looking for another way to have a sense of, let's call it, insurance around the experiences that we're putting our money into. Rise of crowdfunding, again, has made it possible for us to develop games this way, where we're bringing a community in much earlier on in the process. There are certainly risks around crowdfunding, as we've seen over the last year, certainly, and beyond. It's kind of like we've gone from routinely having these Kickstarter game projects that raise multiple millions of dollars to people having a really hard time raising a few $100,000. And we've seen some fantastic creative independent projects on Kickstarter that really should have been successful and really, in my mind, really fit into the model of like what kind of projects should be successful on Kickstarter, and to see them fail, which is really disappointing. And I think there's just been a lot of missteps and failures along the way, and so the community as a whole has kind of lost faith in that model. Certainly the same thing, failure to deliver on what you promised. I'll talk a little bit more about the risks around that later. Early access is kind of like the same idea as crowdfunding, but there's some proof involved because you can't go to early access without a game of some kind. Whereas Kickstarter, as we did, we went to Kickstarter with more of an idea. We showed some footage, but only late in our campaign, and initially we were pitching the game as a concept and the team that could execute on it. This is very different from what you can do with early access. With early access, you have to have software that people can actually play, and so right away you've got a little bit more of a sense of proof. Of course, the risk there is that you live with other people's mistakes. I mean, you certainly live with your own mistakes, but you also live with other people's mistakes. So generally speaking, one of the sort of eye-opening experiences for us on early access is how much hostility there is towards it from the Steam community itself and from people in general, as they've been burned so many times, and you're probably going to burn them too. And anytime you have someone who comes along who actually hasn't even played your game, they're happy to jump into forum discussions or into Steam reviews and kind of like reinforce their anger about an other early access experience that they had that has nothing to do with you. And you're kind of inheriting all that doubt when you go to the platform. So crowdfunding, this is a system by which you engage with future customers through appeals to emotion. It goes back to what I said before about our own campaign. Generally speaking, Kickstarter is an emotional appeal. You're like trying to pitch this concept. You are trying to make people see that, you know, without their support, it won't be as successful, or maybe it won't even get made in some cases. And so it's really more of an emotional thing. I don't think it's a rational decision. Any of you who've made games and looked at any of the Kickstarter budgets that people ask for, you know that it's mostly bullshit. So it is really more about kind of appealing to people's either their love of your high concept or their desire to like stick it to the man, because they think that, you know, this is I think how Double Fine started out and had a lot of success early on, was that, you know, they positioned it very wisely as, if you guys don't jump in and help out, these games won't get made anymore because no publishers want to put money into them. So it's really about an emotional appeal. I think when you're running a Kickstarter project, you tend to think of it, I know certainly we thought of it this way, it's a way to test your ideas against an audience before you take something too far. So if we had gone with our with our campaign to Kickstarter for The Long Dark and failed to raise money, or, you know, had a very sort of lukewarm reception, I think that would have caused us to kind of doubt what we were doing, or at least we would second guess ourselves enough that we would ask ourselves, is this really something that we want to move forward with? So really for us, it was about sort of early on saying, here's the thing that we want to do. Are there enough people that are interested in us doing it to kind of give us some sense of confidence that they'll be there to buy it when it's done? Sometimes how backers see it is a bit contrary to how you might see it. So ideally, and I would say this is the vast majority of people, at least in my experience, with our campaign, is most people are giving you money because they think your project's interesting and they want to see it get made. They almost don't even have an expectation beyond, actually they don't have any expectation. I've actually backed 30 or 40 projects of my own on Kickstarter that I don't think I've ever even collected most of the rewards for. So it's more like I just want to see that thing get made, and then you kind of forget about it, right? And I think that's how a lot of people think about it. Some people think of it as a cheap pre-order, which unfortunately I think is not really the best way to think about it, but there's certainly those people who approach it more as a value proposition, like if I get in early on the Kickstarter on something that looks good, it'll only cost me this much now versus something more later, so I may as well just get in because it's a good deal. Flaws with crowdfunding. Typically, you have to make promises way too early in the development process. So any of you who've made games know how much things can change over the course of development. And the things that you started out with in concept development and the thing that you ship at the end, even though they're, you know, they might be similar, getting down to promising specific features and things, which a lot of people on Kickstarter are doing, is very, very dangerous, because we all know that it's very hard to deliver on something that's going to be 1 year out from now or 2 years out from now. People have no idea generally how hard it is to make a game or how much it costs. So when you say that you need $1 million or $250,000 or whatever it happens to be. That may sound like a lot to people. That might sound like not a lot to people. Some people think that if you raise $200,000 to make a good-sized, mid-core game, they're like, oh, the dev team's like just sort of flush with cash, and they don't have any concept of how much it actually costs to make a game. Backers can carry the expectations of investors, and I understand the psychology around that. And we saw that when Facebook bought Oculus, how angry people were. If Oculus sold for $2 billion, well, I helped kickstart that. How come I don't get some of that $2 billion? And the point is that Kickstarter or any crowdfunding platform that I know of are not actually true investment platforms. You're not giving something in exchange for getting a share of profits or anything like that. It's really, more like philanthropy, really. As I said before, failure breaks the trust and the illusion that the platform depends on. So if Kickstarter is really more of an emotional appeal and people have been burned a bunch of times, or if early access is more of an emotional appeal, people have been burned too many times, you lose a sense of the illusion, or you lose some of the strength of the promise, and it becomes much harder to find engagement there. So early access, I think of early access as a live pre-ordering system that allows you as a developer to pull feedback from your early adopters and bring that feedback into your development process. Again, how you see it or how developers see it. It's a method for collecting early feedback and generating revenue, which is always nice. Often, players look at it as a pre-order, and that's okay. Some of the flaws with early access, it actually turns out that it's, at least I've found it to be not the best place for experimentation, especially when you have a larger community, who's quite invested in the way the game is at the moment. And so some of the things that you might like to do to experiment, in our case, the Sandbox is really the core mechanics of the game, and we're on early access because we want to prove it out, refine the core experience to make it stronger for story mode when story mode launches. For that to work, we need to be able to go out and change the game and try crazy new things and experiment. And it's great for those people who understand that that's why they're there and they're happy to give feedback, but there are some people who get very, very invested in the way the game is right now, and they're very upset when you change it. And so with a large community that can wield quite a lot of impact on social media and in the forums and some places where other potential players will go to find information about your game, it becomes a little bit of a situation where you have to be a little bit more cautious about the things that you might try. So I find that this kind of an unfortunate thing about early access is, for us, it should be a place where we can really try to experiment. In reality, it's quite hard to do that, or at least if you're going to try to do things that are a little bit unusual, you better be ready for a backlash from at least some percentage of your constituency. You have a live community that is invested in, feels a sense of ownership and entitlement, which can be a good thing, but isn't always. Because, as I said, many can't adapt to the changes, or they don't want to, and they will express their displeasure as vocally as they can. They will go into forums and create a lot of trouble for you. They will go after you on social media. They will use Steam reviews to try to hurt you. They will do a bunch of things like that. So it's definitely, again, a platform that if you're going to use it as a place to experiment, you have to be aware of these things. So what you need to know about Steam. So reviews, you have to keep in mind that for a lot of people who write Steam reviews, which actually will end up being a fairly small percentage of your total user base, for a lot of them, their opinion and the truth is the same thing. So they'll say something about their experience of your game, which may or may not be true, but it doesn't really matter if it's true, because for them it's true. And so you can't discuss it with them. It's not a dialogue. It's like, this is what's wrong with the game. And it's the way that this, if any of you have written a review or have a game on Steam, you know what I'm talking about. This sort of the review system is not set up in such a way where you can really discuss people's feedback. It's not about that. It's like, I've made a decision about the game. I think it's awesome. I think it sucks. It's just there, and there's no process or mechanism for you to kind of go in and have a discussion about that and say like, oh, thanks for the feedback. Have you thought about this? Or actually, this is wrong. You can put notes as a developer, but it's really not set up for that. So that can be challenging. In our experience, negative reviews are generally upvoted more than positive ones. And I should say we have over 95% positive reviews on Steam right now. So we have something like 5,600 reviews, and all but 200, I don't know the math right now, but 260, let's say, are negative, and the rest are all positive. So over 5,000 positive reviews. And what we tend to see is the negative ones get upvoted more because they seem to channel like a frustration that people in the community might feel. And actually, something to keep in mind is that Steam reviews are not limited to people who've actually played your game. They need to play your game or have it in their Steam account to write a review, but they don't have to have your game or have played it to comment on a review. So what we've seen is if we've had negative reviews, what often comes out of that is it becomes like a focal point for people who are pissed off about other games in early access that they've played. And you'll get sort of dogpiled for that. It'll be like, oh, they're just like that other game that totally screwed me over. And, and they've not even tried your game. They don't, they might try it and have a great experience with it, but they've already decided in their minds that you're trying to, screw them over. So it's challenging. As I said, many people hate early access and want you to fail. You just have to know that going into it. You have to understand that you're really walking into an environment where there is a fair bit of hostility, and you've got to be prepared to deal with that from the very beginning. Forums, you have to remember that your forums is not just your community for your game. It's open to everybody on Steam. And so what that means is, and that's a very positive thing, and it's also something you have to be aware of, because sometimes you'll pull in feedback from people who are not playing your game but are playing a similar kind of game that don't like your game. Like what we experience a lot of is, like, we don't have zombies in our game, and we don't have a lot of combat, almost none in our game. And our crafting system is quite different from what some of the other survival games like DayZ or Rust or whatever are doing. And so what you'll just get like all these people from the other communities that really just want your game to be more like the games that they really love. And so you kind of have to just be aware of that. You're not just talking to your own players. And again, you inherit other games' successes and failures, which can be good, but it also can be challenging. So often you're having to answer for things that other games have done. Steam sales events, such an important part of Steam. I think these are really critical to any game on Steam's success. Did any of you attend the talk earlier today that was about indie sales? Quite a few of you, yeah. So you saw like kind of the range of numbers, and it's certainly like quite mind-boggling when you think about how many games or how many units are getting sold on Steam. In our experience, being included in the big sales events, it's like a curated thing. So you have to be invited to participate in those by Steam. How do you get selected for that? It's really based on how happy your customers are, and that's kind of what they'll say to you if you ask them, like, what determines whether you get to be in a sale? How happy are your customers? Happy customers is measured by how many people have obviously bought your game, how many people are happy with your game, which is expressed through reviews, and to some degree, how active is your community. So I know in our case, we've had amazing support from Steam. They've been really happy with the sales that we've done. They've invited us to participate in all the big sales events, which have had a huge impact on our success. And a lot of that comes down to how active our community is, how many positive reviews we have, the fact of things like the metric that I gave you before about how within 48 hours of launching our community translation tool, we had 14 new translations. And so they look at that and they're like, okay, here's a community that is very, very engaged in this game. For us, the sales events so far, so we've been on Steam about 160 days. About 25 of those days actually have been sales days for us. We participated in the fall sale, the winter sale, which was like 15 days on its own, and then we just did a midweek madness, and there's been a couple things along the way. So it's about 25 days altogether. So about 15% of our time on Steam has actually been in sales. We've done 7 days in the top 10, which has been amazing for our success as well. And I would say sales events, those specific sales events have generated about 70% of our total unit sales. And I can tell you right now, the winter one is the one you want to be in. It is huge, the amount of volume that goes through on that day. I would say it's probably 10 times as much volume as what you would see on a large sales event that's not during the winter, which is the large sales event is already a multiplier on what you would normally see on Steam. So those events are huge and critical to your success. All right, some tools for early access to try and speed up a little bit. Obviously, forums and community moderators are so important. Steam, for us, is our largest community. I would imagine if you have a PC game, it's probably going to be your largest community as well. What we found is those players are not likely to migrate to another community. So we have a community on Steam, we have our own official community, and then we have Reddit and other things on social media that we're doing. And at one point, we tried to encourage Steam players to move to our official forums, because our official forums actually the tone is quite different from what we've seen on the public Steam forums, and we're trying to encourage certain like a type of interaction on there. And what we've found is that some people certainly migrated over, but generally speaking, people want to stay in Steam. It's where they are. And my theory is that like a lot of the people that are posting on Steam about your game are also kind of like posting in a lot of forums, for a lot of different games. So they're not likely to migrate. We have Reddit in our own forums too. If you have a large community, be prepared to create a buffer for yourself. This is something that kind of caught us by surprise when we first launched. Until the beginning of this year, I did all the community and social media and everything for Hinterland myself. And I'll tell you, man, it was hard. Like, on some of the Steam days, you would go into the forums and you would deal with and I think we've been really lucky. Like, we have amazing community support. Like I said, only 5% negative reviews, but even still, like, read through 5 or 6 threads of people that are pissed off about something that you've done in the game, and it sucks. It really like takes you down for that day and takes down your motivation. And yeah, you've got to have thick skin. I mean, I've been making games for a lot of years, so I think I have somewhat thick skin, but it could be really damaging to your motivation and your morale. So I think create a buffer for yourself. In my case, I finally realized that I needed to find someone who could kind of be between the community and myself directly so that I would feel they could just kind of filter stuff a little bit more. And that was just for my sanity and also because I got too busy. And I mean, this is sort of a high-level note. Like, I think it's important, what we've seen in our community is because we brought more community management help kind of later in the process, and they've been kind of ramping up and stuff, is we've been a little bit too reactive in our community. So we'll jump in when people are, when moderation needs to happen, when there needs to be bans because people are making racist comments or whatever it happens to be. And I think that that's really not the right way to go about it. I think the ideal is that you've got people that have been part of that community for quite a while, so that when they have to put the hammer down on somebody, like, the rest of the community kind of rallies around that because they already have trust with you. So that's definitely like a high-level note for anyone that's doing this, is make sure you get, you have a presence in your community, an active presence, really early in development, all the way through. And I actually think having a community manager who's like one step removed from the day-to-day development has actually been really useful, because it also allows, when the developers have time to jump in and talk to the community, it kind of makes it more of an event. So like, we did a Reddit AMA recently, which was really well received, and it was kind of like I went in there and talked to the community directly, and that was different from the community managers doing it because it's someone from the dev team, and people, like our fans, seem to really like that kind of engagement. YouTube and Twitch, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I kind of think that, in my experience, having gone through the period where like traditional reviews from journalists was so important, what I've seen from like the rise of YouTube and Twitch is it's kind of like, I won't call it, I said the new journalism, and they're not journalists, obviously, but the level of influence that they have is greater than I think, and I hate to say it, are there any journalists in this room? Sorry, yeah, good. Bad news for you, get on YouTube. No, it's kind of crazy how, like, if we only use the metric of increased sales, which I actually don't think is a very good metric, but it's one that's easy to measure. Like, when we have coverage on Polygon or something, we get a little bit of a bump, and there's certainly some awareness. But when we have a YouTuber, which we've been fortunate to have with like 3 or 5 million subscribers, who decides to do like a Let's Play, the impact is way greater. And then that person who did a Let's Play, if they've had a lot of interest in that, they may do a long series about that. And my theory is, whereas some of us may read a publication for a specific journalist and their point of view, generally we just go for news. When you follow someone on YouTube, they're a personality that you trust. You watch their content because you believe in what they say, and if they tell you that a game is good, you tend to believe that. And so I think they have a huge amount of influence over, in some cases, very large communities. I also think, generally speaking, YouTube and Twitch is more participatory than just reading an article online, so that kind of leads to stronger engagement as well. It doesn't make sense for all games. We've been really lucky that our Sandbox is kind of very replayable, and so it lends itself to YouTube. I would love to say that we did that on purpose, but we certainly didn't. It was just like an outcome of the core gameplay, and just turned out that it works really well for YouTube and Twitch, and we've had a lot of success there. Again, much bigger impact, in my opinion, than high-profile traditional coverage. I still think critical reviews are very, very important. I don't think you should ignore them, but I think that what we're seeing is that YouTube personalities, Twitch personalities definitely have a lot of influence. Social media, great way to speak to people who are already engaged. Haven't seen a lot of success, and maybe we're just doing it wrong. I haven't seen a lot of success with kind of converting people to becoming players or members of our community because of social media, but certainly it's a way to engage the community that you already have. It's great for short communication. I think what we try to do and what I would recommend is that you use Facebook and Twitter and some of these other things to bring people to your owned communities. So whether it's your official forums, if you have such a thing, or your website where you're giving them content, and that adds value to the experience. And that's what we're trying to do right now is use social media to bring people to us so that we can then make them part of our community. Mailing lists are great just for kind of less frequent communication. Lots of people won't participate in your forums. For us, it's like between 0.5% and 1% of our total players are very active in all our communities, and I don't think that's unusual. I think that's probably fairly common. Mailing lists just lets you kind of blast out to a whole bunch of people who might want a different level of frequency of awareness about your game. So it works pretty well. Everybody can read an email or ignore it in my case. Just keep in mind that if you use MailChimp, which we do, it often gets flagged as spam, or Gmail categorizes it as a promotion, so it doesn't appear in the inbox. It appears in that other category, so it's a bit of a pain. And I suggest you segregate lists. You have like prospective fans who are interested, but they're not currently playing your game. You have people who are playing your game, and then press is sort of a different category. Analytics. With a large volume of players, I think you really need to gather data. You can't really like deal with it as a mechanism of just reading forum posts and getting the gist of things. Like, hey, I read 10 people say they're mad about this thing, so maybe that means we should change it. Like, you need to start pulling actual numbers, because what you'll see is what people say and what they do is often not the same thing. And it also allows you to kind of pull a large scale of information to make really like more informed decisions. We haven't found any great solutions for analytics on our game because we're not a free-to-play game and we're not a mobile game. It seems like a lot of the analytics solutions are targeted that way. If you know of a great one, please send me an email after this talk and let me know. We're using kind of like an analytics package that's designed for free-to-play mobile games, and we've kind of just like hacked it so that it works for us. And we pull some useful data from it, but it's not as useful as it could be. So just keep that in mind. I still think some data is better than no data, and sometimes you'll be really surprised by the results, or they'll really validate your decisions. We recently, we found that in our community, we observed that we had two very distinct types of players. We had people who connected with the game as an emotional experience that wanted to kind of wander through the wilderness and look at sunsets and kind of pick it up as a poetic, emotional experience. And then we had people who were looking for the most hardcore survival simulation that they could find. And we realized, like, holy those are two different, really different players. Excuse me. So we created what we called experience modes, which is different from difficulty, although they do map to difficulty as well. We created 3, Pilgrim, Voyageur, and Stalker. And Pilgrim is really like, wander through the world and soak it up, and no wildlife will harass you, and it's just like, go play the game and walk through the woods and look at sunsets while you're freezing to death. And then Voyageur was kind of balanced between exploration and survival and sort of the way that kind of I envisioned the game should be played. And then Stalker was pushed really challenging for the people who were looking for that experience. And what we ended up realizing was when we pulled data, excuse me, about 60% of our players actually chose that middle setting, which was pretty awesome. Almost 25% picked the Pilgrim, and then it was like only like 12 and a bit % that played the Stalker, the hardest mode. And what was interesting about that was we correlated strongly like our feedback from community with that type of players. And it's not surprising, really. The people who are more hardcore about your game tend to be more engaged, spend more time talking about it, want to share more of their ideas. But what can happen is, without the understanding of like how the players actually break down, you might think that those players are the whole of your community, and you might make design decisions that actually are contrary to what the other people are looking for. So I think that's a good example of how metrics can be really useful. One thing that we did early on is we recruited out of our original Kickstarter community a group of people that we call the Scouts, which are basically our like super playtesters, and they're people who actually were recruited out of our highest tier backers on Kickstarter. So these were people that gave, I think it was either $1,500 and up to our Kickstarter campaign. So it was a list of people, and then we went to them, and after we sort of saw how they were playing the game and the feedback that they were giving us, and this is before we even came to early access, we sort of said, like, here's a group of people who kind of represent different playing styles and have really good knowledge of the game and really love the game, and they love us, like they love the company, and they want to help us. So let's bring them into our playtesting process. And so they've been a great resource all the way through. They know the game better than anyone. They actually are a small enough group that you can kind of manage feedback. And I don't use them to the exclusion of what we get from early access and on our own forums and whatnot, but I use them as a good first pass on a lot of stuff. So if I want to make some changes in the game and I just want to get some feedback on it, because it's a pretty big game now, it's hard to kind of always know exactly what the right thing is. I put it to those guys. They give me the hard truth about it. Sometimes it influences decisions. Sometimes they say, look, we're going to move forward with it anyway, even if they don't like it. But it's been a really useful tool, and I recommend that you consider something like that. We started them really early, so they sometimes also serve as project memory. They'll kind of come back to me sometimes and say, like, oh yeah, do you remember when we did that? You tried to do that same thing in version like 1.52, and I'll be like, what? And I'll look back and I'll realize, oh yeah, I've actually already tried to do that once before, and the community didn't like it, and blah, 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 blah. So it's sometimes handy to have a group of people who are only interacting with the game like as playtesters at that level, because you get so like, especially when as the games get bigger, you get so caught up in all the minutiae that you sometimes forget like all the things that you've done. You also have to recognize their biases. Some of them are, typically because they've been playing the game for a long time, they do tend to skew a little bit towards the more hardcore. Because our community is not mostly hardcore, you always have to be aware of that when you're getting feedback. So they're useful impact, but they're not a decision maker. They're just another tool. Okay, holding the line and vision. So this is one that, for me personally, has been a pretty big challenge, is because I do come from that world where it's more about having a specific vision that you're trying to drive through like all the obstacles of development to a world where you're bringing other people into the conversation. I think that some of the risks can be you get really overwhelmed by all the feedback. There can be so much feedback, and you just, at some point, you're like, oh, I don't know what to do. There's just so many people talking to me. Sometimes your community's feedback can also start to sway your team. And so, because your team is also reading things in the forums, and if they see something that the community doesn't like about their particular area of the game, they might be really influenced by that. They may come to you and say like, oh, look, I saw this person write about how they really hate this thing that I did, like I really want to change it. And then you're like, okay, wait, let's sit down and talk about it. Let's make sure it's the right thing. Let's not just like sort of be pulled back and forth by one forum comment or 10 forum comments. Let's make sure that we are making the decisions for the right reasons. So you have to be aware of that. Support for the game or for even specific features in the game can kind of like really wax and wane from update to update as you tune the game differently or make changes or whatever. So that's just something to be aware of, is that sometimes you put out an update and people are like, I love that feature, it's so awesome. And you're like, yeah. Next update, they're like, what the fuck did you do? It's so bad now. And then you're like, boo. But sometimes you still have to make that choice. Sometimes that version that the people who've been playing your game don't really love currently needs to change for a certain reason, and then over time they'll actually come around. They'll change their minds. So it's just something you have to be aware of, is that it's a dynamic thing. It's always changing. You can be really biased by a vocal minority. I told you, our active community really in the forums is actually a very small percentage of our total players, so we have to be really aware of that. As I said, between 0.5% and 1%. Really, you sold them on your vision. You have to stay true to it. That was what got people to back you on Kickstarter. That's what got people to pay for your game on early access. You have to articulate it clearly, both internally and externally, so your team has to understand what you're trying to do, the community has to understand what you're trying to do, and you have to stick to it. You have to show strength and confidence. Sometimes it's really hard, especially when you hear like a lot of voices kind of yelling at you. You've just got to kind of trust your gut sometimes. You just got to believe that what you're doing is right. My wife shared this quote with me recently. I thought it was really appropriate for this. Don't dig up and doubt what you planted in faith. I think that's kind of a really nice way to encapsulate game development as a whole, is sometimes you put something in because you believe it needs to be done. Don't dig it up just because you have a moment of doubt about it. Secrets of a successful launch. If we can call ours successful, I think some of the things that have worked in our favor is we knew that early access was going to be sort of let's call it a hostile environment to kind of come into. And so our way to mitigate the risk around that was to make sure the game was ready for that. And the way we did that was we just exceeded expectations. So we knew that typically why people were upset about early access games was that there wasn't enough content, the games were really buggy, the games crashed, the polish wasn't there, blah, 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 blah. So we said, okay, we're not going to go to early access with this thing until the game is super solid, the content's really polished, like all the things we knew were going to get dinged on. And so even still to this day, that is one of the things I think that our game is most well known for. In fact, that's why I'm here today. Like, I didn't submit this talk. I was asked by GDC to come talk to you about our experience with early access because I think publicly it's acknowledged to be one of the better run early access campaigns or projects, and I think it really comes down to that, is that we brought our professionalism and our, I guess, perfectionism in some cases from our AAA background to early access, and we treated our launch on early access as kind of like a small launch of the game. We didn't treat it as, here we're just going to throw something over the fence at you and let you find the bugs. We made sure that it was polished, bug-free, really stable. The game doesn't crash. I mean, it crashes very rarely. It's very polished. The UI and everything's really, go play the game and you'll see what I mean. It's a very, very polished experience, and that was very intentional on our part. Sometimes you're going to have to be more polished than you would like to, because don't forget, the more polished you push something, the harder it is to change it afterwards. So there's a little bit of a, you're taking a risk there too, but I think it's important. And then updating often. We try to update, put out a significant update every month. We tend to do it. We usually follow that update with 3 or 4 small hot fixes because we break things sometimes. Yeah, so we're really responsive with updates. I think that's important. I think we also probably put way more into our updates than we really need to, so there's something about scope that you might want to consider there. But I do think updating frequently is another part of the success because, let's face it, there have been projects on early access that have kind of gone dark, or they have many, many months between their updates. And the community's attention wanes really quickly. So we've got ours on a monthly cycle. People start bugging us when we get close to that month if we haven't announced something, because we've sort of trained them to expect it. And I think that's been a good thing for us. Building engagement, I think it's, for me anyways, I don't really believe that social media builds engagement. I think people don't want to just constantly be tweeted and have articles shared with them on Facebook. They're looking for something stronger than that. And what we've come to the conclusion is that what they're looking for is more original content, and that's something that we're going to be pushing forward within the future. We're shifting all our web presence for the game around something that's more content focused, so a little bit more almost like editorial, because we want to share with our community actual original content. Not just hey, here's a review that someone wrote, or here's a cool, Let's Play, or here's a neat piece of fan art or whatever, but here's something that we've made for you that we want to share with you about the game, whether it's analysis of survival games as a whole, or whether it's talking about a particular painter and how they might have inspired the art style, or whatever it might be. And I'd like to think that will create stronger engagement with our community. We'll see what happens, but I really do believe in that approach. YouTube and Twitch is something that we haven't been that active on ourselves as a studio that we're going to start spending more time on. I think that's important. Dev diaries, obviously people are interested in supporting a project like this because they want to know more about your process of development, so I think that's part of how you can give it to them. Editorials, as I mentioned, original content. That isn't necessarily even about the game specifically, but is again just trying to give something to the community. Merchandise, something that we're rolling out more of. And then excuse me, talking to and talking with your fans. So not just sending stuff out to them, but engaging them in a bit of a dialogue and listening to what they have to say is very, very important. Don't fizzle at launch. This is something that, as I mentioned before, I think a lot of early access games tend to do, is they kind of fizzle because they've done everything that they have to do. By the time they are done with early access and they go into launch on Steam for real, they don't have anything left to show. So that's really important. As I said, I think that what we're trying to do is with our story mode is that's going to be our real launch, and we're going to try to create a little bit of space around that. Thank you. As I said, it's the true launch. So some conclusions. I think these new platforms for community-informed development, Kickstarter, crowdfunding in general, early access have really changed the way that we approach game development. There's a lot of positives, but there are also some negatives, which I've called out to you. I think you need to be aware of those if you're going to go onto these platforms. This is just insight into our experience, which is certainly not the truth, but it's just some things that we've learned, so hopefully that's useful to you. I don't believe that it's our job to make the game that the community wants. I think it's our job to make our community want what we have made. So we're engaging them in that process. We're taking their feedback, but ultimately they've given us money because they believe that we can create something amazing for them, and that's our job. So don't lose sight of that. Navigating that dynamic can be really treacherous, so just be aware of it. I think with the right approach, the right tools, and a lot of luck, you can survive that and still walk away with a community that's really, really supportive of you and engaged in your game. So that's all I have. I didn't ramble terribly, but I didn't leave a lot of time for questions, but I have about 10 minutes, so I'm happy to answer some right now. Hi.
How's it going? Thanks for the talk.
No problem. Awesome. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. Oh, thank you all for coming.
And I love the game. The game's awesome.
Thank you.
I have one simple question. When do you share a prototype? Like when you got a prototype and you're doing some iterative design and you got your mechanics nailed down, at what point do you approach the community with something, knowing that it may not be pretty, and then you got to filter out all the dev people versus true gamers and trying to make an opinion on a product that's not finished and they can't see the long-term vision of what that product will be?
Yeah. So when?
Yeah.
I think it depends on so many different things, right? I mean, but it depends on platform, it depends on the scale. You know, like one thing that I've thought recently about early access that would be interesting is if you could actually limit the number of people that can, like how we used to do betas, right? So with a beta, you would say like, hey, we're only going to have like 1,000 slots or 500, then we're going to do 1,000, then we're going to do 10,000 and kind of scale it up, right? It's almost like you'd want to be able to do something like that in early access where you almost limit the number of people and kind of let them come in gradually so that you can deal with that feedback. Certainly there have been examples of games that have crowdfunded, started with a lot less than we have. I mean, look at Minecraft, how much it blew up and what it started out as and what it ended up as. And certainly they benefited from having an ongoing open process and really have it being super iterative, and that worked really well for them. So I think a lot of it depends on who you are, who your studio is, what your game is, where you're going to share it, et cetera, et cetera. For me, specifically around early access, I think there's definitely an expectation when you go in there. People want to see something that is more polished than you might expect. So that's the big takeaway.
Got it. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Hello, Alexis from Fail Better.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Thank you for your help.
So nice to meet you at this particular moment while you're asking a question.
Much less frightening in person. Slightly less frightening in person. So your point about it being a game that's built in response to player feedback and not by the players is really resonated with me. My question is this something you say explicitly to your community now? And is it something that they get? Or is it something that you have to be tactful about?
I think all of the above. You know, you always have to be tactful about it. I don't think that I do a particularly good job of communicating that to the community because I tend to be pretty forward with them about that. But it's something that we're working more towards through community management to kind of like help people understand. And I think a lot of it has to do with how you respond to people's feedback. You know, certainly whenever someone takes the time to post feedback, the first thing is thank you for the feedback. Because let's face it, whether you agree with it or not, someone spent the time, most of the time, they spent time to think about it and share it. And for them, it's important. So you have to acknowledge that, take the time to analyze it. I think one thing that has been unsuccessful, in my experience, has been trying to actually engage people in a dialogue about things in a public forum. So I actually find it more, you know, if someone has really great feedback and you think they have something to offer, it's almost better to be able to take it into another medium, like take it to email or something like that. Because I find that being in that public forum can bring out a lot of the wrong kind of behaviors in people. But I think that, to speak to your question more directly, like I think our community understands that for us it's about a specific vision, and we have no trouble telling them, like in our forums when people say, I want to have more guns in the game, or I want to have zombies, or I want to have this, I want to have multiplayer, I want to have this. Like we are very firm in saying like that's not part of the vision of the game, this is the vision of the game. We've tried to be really clear on our Steam webpage about what the game is so that people don't have any surprises when they come in. And other than that, if people choose to not read or look at a Let's Play or check our trailer or know anything about the game and buy it and then find out that it's not DayZ in Canada, well, you know, shame on them, basically. Does that answer? All right, thank you.
Hi, big fan, kind of hate Fluffy, but question for you on yeah. Have you seen some of the groups like Portalarium that are doing more of the crowd sharing model, so where the community is actually getting involved in developing or helping with the process? Is that something you guys have considered, maybe with like map editing or like tweaking and making like mods of the game?
I think for the right content, it's a great idea. I think, like I mentioned with our translations, it's a perfect example of something that the community has just taken on and done a really fantastic job with. And we actually started with our translations using a translation company for the first, like we did Russian and German with a translation company. We also did Swedish, Norwegian, French, and French-Canadian with a translation company. With original German and Russian, what we found was that even though 99% of the translation was good, we got a lot of people in the community that were telling us that we got certain words wrong. And so we thought, well, we're spending a lot of money to translate the game. The community doesn't feel super happy with it. Plus, let's face it, there's certain languages and territories where the audience is so small that it's hard to justify spending like thousands and thousands of dollars to translate the game. So we knew that we needed to open up the translation pipeline to them. And as I said, like in 48 hours, we were kind of blown away by the support. So for certain things, I think it makes a lot of sense. Modability is really important to us. we grew up as PC gamers. We know how, like, I mean, I got my start doing Unreal Tournament maps. Like, I get that. It's just more about like the resources and how we're set up to support that in the future. It's not a focus of what we're doing right now, anyway. But
Would you have preferred to build the infrastructure in advance for that?
Well, I think it partly comes down to what kind of game you're making, right? So our game is really about an experience that we're trying to create for our player, not so much about like trying to let other people create their experience within the game, although there is a lot of that as well. But we've had calls, for example, of like, well, just give us all the sliders that you use to tune the game so we can make our own experience. And the experience modes that I mentioned before, Pilgrim, Voyager, and Stalker, were kind of like an outcome of that conversation where people were saying, we just want you to give us all the sliders so we can make our own game, which I think some other games have done. And us saying, well, no, we're actually trying to create an experience for you here. We're not just trying to give you the toolbox to make the game. We want you to feel something about this game. And that requires some authorial intent on our part. So we're going to give you a version of this that allows you to, some of the sliders are preset differently depending on what kind of experience you're looking for. But it isn't a case of just giving you the toolbox and saying, here you go, just make your own game. Now, once the game is out and we've established what that experience is and people understand it better, then I think there's a good chance that we would open that up and like invite people to create their own content. And I think there's a lot of different ways to create experiences too. Like I find that even within the context of our Sandbox, which has no story, tons of people create story. And that's their experience. That's their way of owning the experience and customizing the experience. So it happens on different levels. All right, thank you.
Hey, I'm really digging the game. I had a question about when you decided to go to early access, did you guys think a lot about how long you would spend in early access? And are there any dangers to spending too little or too much time in a medium like that?
We did think about it. And I think it even still says on our Steam page that we plan to be there for 3 or 4 months, and we've already been in for longer than that. I think that there is a danger of staying in early access for too long. I think our way out of that is that we have a story mode launch that's going to be happening this year, and that's going to kick us out of early access whether we're ready to or not. I think for us, really, early access is still a process of engaging the community that we have. We're still pulling a lot of useful feedback from that community while in parallel we build out the story mode of the game. And the other thing is once you have that community, you can't just walk away from it. So as much as it might be nice from a development standpoint to say, we're done with you for now, we got what we needed, we're going to move on to the finishing story mode and we'll come back when it's done, I think people would be really mad if we did that, right? So people have an expectation that they can continue playing, that we're going to keep updating the game, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a responsibility to do that while we finish the rest of the game, essentially. Sorry. I think I have time for one more question. Does anyone have any interest in going to the wrap-up? Or did you get what you need? Okay, a few of you, we can go there if you want. Otherwise, I encourage you or welcome you to contact me. Don't encourage you to do it, but welcome you to contact me. My email's right here. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you.